Compassion isn't a word that we use much today. I have an old concordance that's based on the King James version of the Bible. That tells you how old it is. In a concordance, you can look up a word and it will give you a list of Bible verses that include that word. And when I looked up the word compassion, it gave me a long list of references throughout the Bible. But when I narrowed it down to verses relating to Jesus, I found 12 references. And when I looked up those verses in the Good News Bibles, not one of them used the word compassion. Mostly it had been changed to pity, once to mercy, and once to sorry for. But it seems to me that none of those words have the same depth of meaning as the word compassion. You can be sorry for someone. You can pity them from a distance, but not do anything about it. Do you remember when we were looking at James last year? He said, "What good is it if you see somebody needing clothes or food and you don't do anything about it?" You can show mercy to someone. You can forgive them some debt or some hurt. But that's often more of a one-off event. It's not a continuing emotion or action. Compassion involves so much more than that. The root of the word, which I'm told is Greek, is related to the gut. And it points to a deep-seated and disturbing emotion, an emotion that requires action. Jesus was moved to compassion. Someone else's suffering and heartbreak becomes ours, and we need to address it in some way. When Matthew writes in verse 36, as Jesus saw the crowds, his heart was filled with compassion for them. It could only mean that he needed to respond. And verse 35 gives us in a nutshell what that response was, what his mission was. He preached the good news and healed people of every kind of disease and sickness. After his baptism and his temptations, Jesus went to Nazareth, his hometown. And in the synagogue on the Sabbath, he stood up and he announced that the passage that he'd just read from Isaiah had come true because it referred to him. Previous prophecies from the Old Testament and from John the Baptist had all spoken of a future event. God will send, someone will come. But when Jesus read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," because he's chosen me to bring good news to the poor, proclaim liberty to the captives, sight to the blind, freedom to the oppressed, he assured his listeners that it was happening now. He was here to fulfill that mission. And Matthew reaffirms that mission, a mission that was born of compassion. When we are faced with a situation that needs compassion, we have to decide how we're going to handle it. We'll all have different ways of tackling problems, but those first steps can be very important. Sometimes they decide whether or not our involvement will be welcomed, whether it'll be useful, whether it'll be sufficient. In most situations, the first step would be to physically meet up with the other person. Long-distance help is better than nothing, but how often do we find that close contact sheds a totally different light on our understanding of the situation? And how much comfort does it give to know that we care enough to actually be there in person? Jesus came in person. And it's an amazing truth that he left the glories of heaven to be with those who needed him in person, so they could see his compassion at work. I think I've mentioned this before, but in our Bible study group, we often talk about old films with biblical themes. I think it might be a bit of an age thing because many of you here will never have seen the kind of films that I'm talking about, you know. Films like the Ten Commandments and Samson and Delilah and so on. And around the same time, there were films about other religions and their gods. So you get, for example, Jason and the Argonauts or Jason and the Golden Fleece, things like that. Many of those films depicted their gods as residing above mortals in some kind of heaven, looking down on them, watching to see what would happen. Sometimes they intervened, but they never descended to get involved in the lives of the people. When God decided the time was right, Jesus came to where he was needed, to respond to that need, to get involved with the people in need. And so he didn't stay in Nazareth, where he'd spent his early years. He didn't stay in Capernaum, which became a base for a lot of his travelling ministry. He didn't stay in Jerusalem, where all the religious leaders were. Matthew tells us he went round visiting all the towns and villages. Compassion motivates people to go out of their way to relieve the physical, mental, emotion, and spiritual pain of others. And Matthew tells us that his first concern was that the people were worried and felt helpless. They were like sheep without a shepherd. They had no one to turn to for guidance. Now, there was a synagogue in every community that had at least 10 male adult Jews, and each synagogue had a leader. They had copies of many of the Old Testament writings. They had all the oral traditions that had been passed down through each generation. And yet Jesus saw their leaders and rabbis as failing in their duty to teach the people about God and his laws. They never spoke with any clarity or authority about God and his commandments. Jesus had come to meet that need and provide them with answers to their many questions. He'd come to share in their lifestyle and feel their frustration. It wasn't only the daily grind of living in an occupied country. It wasn't only the poverty and the sickness that went with it. It was the loss of their sense of self-value, the loss of their God-given identity, along with the hopelessness of finding no one to teach them and nurture them. He knew what they needed, and he could fill that need. And so we're told that he travelled throughout all the towns and villages, announcing that the kingdom of God had come. The amazing compassion of Jesus was first and foremost to reunite the people with God, to preach the kingdom. Every other act of compassion, healing, forgiveness, encouragement, was to point them to God, to authenticate his authority to speak for God. We can often be caught up in a situation where we can do very little to help. We can be present, we can listen, we can say a kind word, we can give a gentle touch, but there are times, many times, when we can offer no solution. Nothing that we can say or do will change the situation. But Jesus had, and he still has, that divine ability to bring healing and new life. And he's not limited in what he can do or when he can do it. And so the gospel was preached and the people were healed. Jesus not only had the ability to help, but his compassion for the people meant that he had to help, whatever the cost to himself. In the previous chapter, Matthew tells of a leper who comes to Jesus, and he kneels down and he says, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus replies, "I am willing, be clean." No one who ever comes to Jesus with a genuine need is ever turned away. Compassion won't allow it. But it was at a cost to Jesus. Another miracle that's recorded in the same chapter is of the woman who suffered from continual bleeding, which meant not only a debilitating condition, but that she was barred from public worship. You know the story. She came as close to Jesus as she could get, just to touch his clothes, and she knew immediately that she was healed. And although Matthew doesn't record it, Mark says that Jesus knew that power had gone out of him. There is a cost to compassion, even to Jesus. And on many occasions we read that he withdrew from even his disciples to be alone with his Father, to reaffirm his ministry, to recharge his batteries. So who was amazed at the compassion of Jesus? Well, we've probably got to agree that the first people we would identify would be those who've been healed. Chapter 8 and chapter 9 contain 10 accounts of individual miraculous healings, all kinds of different people, men, women, children, all with different illnesses, but all were people whose lives would never be the same. And we can understand their amazement. But there were many others who were healed, unidentified people. But they too would all be amazed at what was happening. But these weren't the only people who were amazed. Prior to these two chapters, full of miracles, Matthew devotes 3 chapters, chapter 5 to chapter 7, to what we know as the Sermon on the Mount, the longest recorded speech that Jesus made. 3 chapters of teaching about every aspect of the kingdom of God. And chapter 7 finishes with these words: "The crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law." The compassion of Jesus doesn't only touch our physical well-being, it touches our relationship with God. And many of those who heard him responded. Like the woman who went into the house of Simon the Pharisee, where Jesus had been invited for a meal, and she began to anoint the feet of Jesus and wipe them with her hair. That was her response to the compassion that she'd felt from Jesus. And throughout the Gospels, we find this response to Jesus. The miracles drew large crowds, filled with awe and wonder at what they were seeing. But it was the individual encounters that produced amazement, that acknowledged the compassion being shown to them. Those occasions when Jesus assured people that their sins were forgiven. When he actually touched people instead of shunning them. When he stood up for the woman taken in adultery. When he ate with notorious sinners and tax collectors who nobody else wanted to be bothered with. When he welcomed women who came asking for a blessing on their children. All examples of the amazing compassion of Jesus. So how do we view that compassion? Have we experienced it? Do we want to experience it? do we continue to experience it? Do we respond to it? Have we become so accustomed to it that we take it for granted? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves today. I always remember somebody that Phil invited some time ago who said we always come to that point in the message when we have to say to ourselves, so what? So what? What does that mean to us? These are the questions that we need to ask as we stop, fix our eyes once again on Jesus, until we too find that we are amazed at his compassion shown to each one of us.